Hi, welcome. Another lecture. We're moving from China and East Asia, moving back westward, and we're going to make our way back to Europe, but not quite yet. Two more lectures on the architecture of Islam. What we're looking at, the breathtaking ornamentation and detail work and symmetry and organic representation is one of our vocabulary words for this portion of the semester. And this is a mukarna, Mukarnas, mukarnas or mukarna. Mukarnas, it's one element, although it's used in the plural format. Let me give you the proper definition, and I will start sharing the vocabulary. I'll prepare the vocabulary terms list as we make our way past this lecture, past the next lecture I will be posting in the next couple of days. And I'm going to assign your second essay, which is going to be on anything that you see from this lecture or the subsequent lecture on the architecture of Islam. Mukarnas is essentially defined as ornamental vaulting, and it's the resolution of a vertical as it transitions to a horizontal ceiling space, or as you transition from a wall to a vault. So the mukarnas is a different way of articulating a lot of the work that you've already seen. We've seen how the tholobate transitions to a dome. We've seen an arcade. We've seen a crossing, a dome crossing. We've seen basically a vault intersecting with a vault. We've seen rib vaulting. So this is just yet another variation of the same architectural problem resolved in a slightly different way. Let me move over here. Okay, so just to kind of set a little bit of context, as you know, we effectively began our semester in humanist Italy, made our way sort of northward and eastward into Eastern Europe, into Ukraine, into Russia, on through China, eastward towards Japan, and we're effectively making our way back westward. And while the work that we're going to look at is predominantly here in what is today known as Turkey, it's the work that it's effectively a new country that is being established, or a new empire, I should say. It's a country today. Turkey is a country today, but in the time period we're in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, rather, the Ottomans are really a new people to this region, and the Ottomans are formerly Seljuk and then Turkic people that basically come from the steppes of Asia, which is effectively the horizon line that form. And I'm not a geologist. I'm not sure if this is actually where two tectonic plates come together or not. What I do know um, is that I believe this is the separation between the Asian tectonic plate and the tectonic plate that forms Europe. I'm not sure if there's another separation here, but effectively the Ottomans, which are going to occupy this part of the world for starting now from the 15th century on until today, the people we know as Turkish people are those who emanate from the steppes, make their way down and into the Bosphorus is effectively the strait, the narrow body of water that separates Turkey from really the continent of Europe. and the Ottomans are going to establish themselves here and then cross over the Bosphorus as well. So just to kind of give you a context of sort of where we are, the people groups that we're talking about, and the parts of the world that we're talking about. The book cites that the Ottoman Turks, 15th century, crossed the Bosphorus from Asia, from the east, and they made their way to the Byzantine Roman Empire. The Byzantine Roman Empire, I've made this point a couple times. This is a class on architecture history from about the 14th century forward, but Byzantine Rome, as probably many of you know, is effectively the division of the Holy Roman Empire into two. Emperor Constantine establishes basically, we have Rome, which is the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. Constantine really kind of defects and not defects, but wants to establish a new Rome in Constantinople, which is today known as Istanbul. And so Constantine establishes a new European, really, city, a headquarters here in Western Anatolia, and Constantinople really becomes the jewel of the Ottomans as they come and occupy this part of the world. Oh, and yes, and so they're making their way into what is basically the what's left of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Roman Empire, and they are occupying this region as now they're establishing themselves, and they want to see glory of a new empire where a prior empire was established, which is the Byzantine Roman Empire. This is going to be the benchmark for the next 200-300 years, although it is a period of rapid production, incredible production, and you're going to see some really amazing work here in this lecture today. All of it is really done in an effort to try and usurp what is probably the crown achievement architecturally of the Byzantine Empire, which is the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Hagiasophia, which I believe is, I can never remember what Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, I think. Let me double check my notes. Yes, Holy Wisdom. So Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or in Constantinople as it was at the time, named after the Emperor Constantine, the foundation of his new city, is a Catholic, is built as a Catholic church, but really over the past couple hundred years, since about the 15th, 16th century, when the Ottomans occupy now this part of the world, it's more commonly known in Islamic culture and really to the rest of the world as a mosque. So although it's not purpose built as a mosque, architecture has been used to take what is otherwise a Catholic church and convert it to really convey the effect of Islamic architecture. The two really most prominent elements that I want to point out, which are also part of the vocabulary term or part of the taxonomy that we're going to study about Islamic architecture today, one of which are the minarets, which are the tower, the narrow and tall tower-like elements, which effectively flank the cathedral or flank the dome at its four corners, was added well after I believe Hagia Sophia was built in the 6th century. It's why we're not really covering it in this course, because we're 1,000 years past this time frame. But as the Ottomans are coming in and establishing the Ottoman Empire, they not only are taking over the Hagia Sophia, what they're trying to do for the next 200-300 years is really achieve something as great as the Hagia Sophia. The minarets, let me give you the proper definition before I move from there. Minaret is a tall, slender tower, usually part of a mosque, with a balcony from which the muezzin calls Muslim prayer. So the muezzin has a very important role in Islamic architecture, which is that there is an incantation or a melodic chant that I want to say he or she, but I believe it's always a male, makes a call, and it's really the call to the it's the sound is projected so it can be heard throughout the city, in any city where there is a mosque, and it's effectively the call to remind the folks that it's time for prayer. And so the minaret becomes the place from which that individual projects the sound of their call to prayer. The second element you can't quite see in this slide. There's a diagram that the book provided that I kind of modified for this lecture later, which is the use of the semidome and the sort of deconstruction and reconstruction of how a semidome can arrange itself around a main central architectural element. Just bear with me for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and the slide comes up towards the end of the lecture. Is really the second thing that I want to point, the characteristic element that the architects of the Ottoman Empire are aspiring to try and replicate or surpass the achievement of Hagia Sophia. So the point is that Hagia Sophia is effectively a benchmark that they are going to try to exceed architecturally, match and exceed architecturally. This is a view of the inside. Again, was built originally as a Catholic church, but has been used as a mosque for, I would say, roughly the past 500 or 600 years. But just a splendid space, a splendid large space. So there's some differences, and I'm not going to get into it now, but you can already start to read a little bit of how space is used in Islamic architecture and how it differentiates itself from the way we've seen space being used in the architecture of Catholicism, predominantly to date, and then even the architecture of Eastern Europe and Russia. And then even contrast that a little bit with the architecture that we just finished looking at in China, which was highly focused on outdoor space and use of negative space. So, be making those comparisons already in your mind. I'm sorry that I didn't realize this had a watermark on it. But this is a view. So this view is kind of to the bottom and to the left of this image. And we're looking towards you can see it here in terms of its taxonomy or in terms of its characteristic breakdown. The rear apse is a real dead giveaway that this is not originally an Islamic church. And there's a couple of elements that I'm going to introduce to you today. One is the mihrab, and the other is, I'll bring them up as they come up. The mihrab is basically a niche inside every Islamic temple, which is basically a carving out of the wall space. Maybe not too indifferent from the rear apse, but it's not a volume added on. Rather, it's space carved out of a surface, which really is the orientation when you're inside of a mosque as to which way Mecca is. As in Islamic architecture, we are supposed to, in prayer, face towards Mecca. And so the mihrab is basically a kind of a north star, if you will, or a compass that tells us this is the direction towards Mecca, and this is the direction towards which we should be praying. Night view of Hagia Sophia. So you can actually start it's going to be best very clearly seen in the image, in the slide, the diagram. But keep in mind, just in the back of your mind for the next few minutes, this idea of the semi-dome, which is effectively a half dome. So just kind of keep that concept in mind, and I think when you see the diagram, it'll really solidify that idea. Whoops, pardon me. Okay, so this is the man that is highly responsible. This is architect Sinan. Let me make sure I get his name right. Oh, Mimar Sinan, Mimar Sinan, Sinan. And he's the state architect of the Ottoman Empire. He's the state architect. He serves in that capacity. He starts in his late 40s, or really kind of at age 50, roughly, to serve in this role, and lives to almost 100 years old. And so for those 50 years that he serves in the capacity of the, quote, state architect, he has an incredibly effective and productive campaign in which he builds over 300 projects under two sultans. Sultans are the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman I and his son Selim II, and through spanning those two emperors, Sinan the Great oversees, like I said, over 300 projects, which we're going to look at 4 or 5 here in this lecture today. This is a statue of Mimar Sinan, and behind him is actually the last project that we're going to look at today. But you can already see the larger point that I was making earlier about how this endeavor of the architecture of the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic architecture of the Ottoman Empire is really all in aspiration of achieving something greater than Hagia Sophia, and the resemblance should be quite evident already of their work and what they are trying to achieve and accomplish. So the architecture goes beyond just religious architecture, as does every empire or every time period and every political organization that we've studied so far. And some of the achievements of the Ottoman Empire, well, I guess really their architecture is I take that back. Some of the other accomplishments under Sinan, Mimar Sinan, as I mentioned, is not just religious architecture, but it includes the walls around the city of Jerusalem, the new walls of Jerusalem, as they're referred to. The Suleiman Bridge, which is also a great achievement architecturally of that time, and the idea of the market is really unique to the Ottoman Empire, both indoor and exterior market. And by market, we mean basically arcaded spaces that have a series of kind of niches or spaces off to the side of the arcade, which brings together street vendors, food vendors, farmers who are selling their product. Really, it's a place for people to get the things they need on a daily basis. So both open air and concentrated bazaar-like arrangements of spaces, and baths as well. And there was one more term. It was actually a new term even for me. Oh, the Imaret, Imaret, which is also a kind of a new accomplishment or a new achievement that comes to us from Ottoman architecture, which is really the idea, and the proper definition is a soup kitchen. It's really the idea is it's a place for those of less means who may not have the resources to prepare a meal at home. It's a place really for the institution to provide a meal to people, but it's often attached to a mosque, a college, or a hospice, and it's really intended to feed those less fortunate in need, but as part of the Quranic responsibilities that people have who are of the Islamic faith. The Quran is their Bible, effectively, or their main book, their main religious book. And there is a Quranic responsibility to, just like there is in the Bible and in many other religion, doctrinal books of any religion, which is, to help other people. And so the Imaret is one of those ways to kind of fulfill that responsibility of feeding people, but is often architecturally adjoined to a mosque, or, as I mentioned, a place of higher learning, or even a civic building. And really, that's a way to kind of bring people and activate space and create kind of liveliness and activity that can have benefit beyond just the function of feeding somebody. You bring 300-400 people around every lunch or dinner time. They eat, and that process may take half an hour, or 2 or 3 hours, let's say, to feed all those people. But they're there. You've already captured, their kind of attention and their presence, and by having other activities around it, you kind of create this atmosphere of civic life. So the Imaret has a very important role in shaping the architecture of the Ottoman Empire. And this is kind of quoted from the book, but the architecture of the Ottomans is really a synthesis of three things. First of which is the vaulted masonry of the Armenian churches. So Armenia is a kingdom that is already established in this time period when the Ottomans are entering this part of the world. They're entering Anatolia. So Eastern Anatolia is effectively where the Armenians are and have been for hundreds and thousands of years at that point. They have an architecture that really kind of parallels, or maybe just slightly precedes, the architecture of the Byzantine Christian Empire. So as Constantine establishes Constantinople and sort of proclaims his belief in the Christian faith, the Armenians, for about 100 years already at that point, since about the 4th century, since the beginning of the 4th century, since 301, they have established their belief in the Christian faith and have an architecture really that is invented around this idea of Christianity, and they're building lots of buildings. The Armenians are very affluent builders. And so this part of the world, Eastern Anatolia, which the Turks are coming through to really establish themselves in Bursa, in Istanbul, and Adrina, are passing through and seeing the architecture of the Armenians, which has been around for a very long time already at that point, and they seem to take to this idea of the vaulted masonry as something that we see them repeat over and over again. This is the church at Saint Haripsime, which is a 7th century church, 618 AD. So to give you an idea of the sort of establishment of that architectural style that's already in this part of the world, that the Turks are coming really through, seeing, and are borrowing elements from masonry architecture. This is the dome that you're looking at on the outside. The prior slide is showing you the inside of it. This is another Armenian church at Sarmosavank, which is a 10th, 11th century church. So later than the prior one, but still about 300 or 400 years before the Turks are coming through. Again, the sort of notion of vaulted masonry architecture is one that they are borrowing from and kind of forming their architecture using this as an inspiration point. So that's one, the vaulted masonry architecture that comes from the architecture of the Armenians. The second is the arcade. They are, again, kind of coming through this part of the world. The Persians have a very, very strong affinity for, and really have some amazingly beautiful arcade characteristic, highly elaborate and detailed masonry and concrete arcades. And this is one of them. And this one is, gosh, where is this? This is not Tabriz. I was thinking Tehran. I knew it wasn't in Tehran. It's in Tabriz, which is a major city in Iran. And so the notion of the arcade is one that the Turks kind of take an affinity to and borrow from as they're creating their own architecture as well. This is another example of a Persian arcade, something very prominent from Persian architecture. And the third element that the book cites is what it calls the beehive domes of the Seljuk tombs. So the Seljuks are really the first, kind of the predecessors of the Ottomans. And the Seljuks are, again, they originate kind of in the steppes of Asia. But apparently they had, and this is something new that I learned from the text, but apparently their tomb architecture used beehive shaped domes, which is not unlike the domes that we just finished studying in Russia. We studied the helmet dome and sort of the partial dome, the Lukovica, if you remember. And so that's another thing that the Ottomans borrow from. And I believe we started the first slide we looked at. I introduced the term mukarnas. And I think this is kind of my conjecture or my 2 cents that I'm adding here. I think as I studied a little bit the architecture of the Seljuk tombs, one of the things that I couldn't help but notice is their use of kind of relief or carving in, as we talk about, as I mentioned earlier, with the notion of the mihrab on the inside of the dome, but also the mukarnas. Yes, it's an additive thing, but it's basically looks as though it's a carving in of a space or of a volume. And if you kind of read this as a plane, as a solid plane, imagine you started kind of with a solid clay block here. You would kind of carve into to create this initial tier of space, and then you'd carve into again a little bit deeper to kind of create this space. And I see here the sort of beginnings of this notion of the mukarnas, which is definitely a unique thing in Islamic architecture. That's one of their sort of contributions or inventions, I would say. And I see this as the kind of starting point or the jumping off point of that notion. Which, as I mentioned, comes from the notion of the Seljuk tombs. Okay, so they start designing and building their own architecture. We're going to start, and this is under Mimar Sinan. The first is this example. This is Orhan. Oh, and the term I'm going to use with respect to really the next 4 or 5 projects is Kami, K-C Amii, Kami, which is synonymous with the word mosque. So Kami means mosque in Turkish. So the first one we're going to look at is Orhan Gazi Kami. This is in Bursa, and I should point out that basically the 3 cities where we're looking at architecture of are Constantinople, Bursa, which is still on the Asian part, I would say, of the kind of continental divide. And then the third city is, let me make sure I get the name right, is Edirne, Edirne. And we're going to look at the last project, which is the Suleimani Kami, is in Edirne, which is on the European side of the continental divide. So really the 3 places are very concentrated. Constantinople, Bursa, and Edirne are really the 3 places. So I just kind of want to make sure that you understand geographically where we are at the same time. Okay, so Orhan Gazi Kami, Bursa, 1339. So we're in the beginning of the 14th, almost middle of the 14th century. The position of the site is interesting in that it overlooks the central markets, and it is another unique thing about Islamic architecture that we start to see in the Ottoman Empire is what the book refers to as the reverse T plan. So it's basically reverse because the leg of the T is really thought of as being here, and then the cross of the T is thought of as being here. So it's effectively an upside down T, and it's upside down because this colonnade, or this portico, if you will, is the entry point of the site. So it's an inverse T because really the flat portion of the T is not the top. It's actually we're entering through the top portion of the T through the leg of the T. That's why the book calls it a reverse T. So I want to make sure you guys understand that point, is that it's a T-shaped plan. This is the actual interior of the building. This is the exterior. I'll go back to the prior slide in just a second. But in the interior portion of the building, you enter. This is the nave and the narthex, and the nave is effectively the portion you enter into, and then this portion is the back portion of the mosque. And again, you don't see a lot of articulation of space. We can actually read all of this as one space, or I would argue at worst, we can read it as one contiguous large space and then two ancillary spaces that are offset. And this, which we'll look at other examples of here, and we'll look at some examples from the interior, is the mihrab. And I didn't give you the proper definition earlier, so let me pause to do that now. The mihrab is, as I said, a niche, which is can often be a pointed arch on top, which orients people in a mosque towards Mecca. Actually, now that I read it, I realize I did explain that to you. Okay, so this is an interior view, and you're looking towards that the second kind of square as you enter through the space. So that photograph is taken about from here, looking this way, and I'm going to point this element out a little bit more clearly on the next slide. Oh, let me go back first because I promised I would make that point. Is the entry portico arcade is the space we enter through, and this is really all outdoor space. And this is, I was going to show the slide. Oh, and the book also makes a point of the biforum arch, if you will, really on the west side of the entry, and it's has its symmetrical similar element on the opposite side. Another thing that is unique to Islamic architecture is this repetition of here we're looking at 5 bays. And when I know we're looking at it at an oblique angle, but I think you can read it fairly clearly here. You're looking at 5 bays, which has a central bay, which is a taller and slightly wider, flanked by slightly narrower and slightly shorter side bays. So that kind of play of narrow, wide, narrow, or narrow, narrow, wide, narrow, narrow is something that we're going to see a lot in the examples of Islamic architecture. Okay, so that's the mihrab. That's the niche in the wall. And you can see, really, this is all kind of just a vast open space. And that is what is orienting us towards Mecca as we're inside of the space. You can see here the squinches as it makes its way up towards the dome. So you're starting to see kind of them exploring and kind of struggling through, coming up with kind of new ideas based on the things that they are borrowing from. 5-bay porch, pointed arches, opus mixtum, biforum entry, and the alternating narrow wide arches, which I talked about. So there's a kind of a little bit of a better view of the mihrab. This is access to a second floor. The Orhan Ghazi Kami is unique amongst unique amongst mosque architecture in the Ottoman Empire, in that it actually has a secondary space that overlooks down over the religious space. And the secondary space doesn't have a religious function. It was for royalty to basically occupy and look over really their subjects, for lack of a better term, as they are worshiping and praying. And that's unique in terms of certainly the work that we're going to look at today, but it's also unique in that that's not a common thing that we see in mosque architecture, in Islamic architecture. And this is kind of an aerial view of it. Um, I'm not sure, to be completely honest with you, where the markets are, but the book makes the point that the siting of it, probably, I think what's key, and you can kind of read it in the topography here, is the building sits on a high point, what we would refer to as a promontory relative to its adjoining spaces. And so it gives it that ability to kind of look down over other surrounding urban spaces. Perhaps it's this space down to the left in this image. I'm not sure. There is another. Okay, so this is the mihrab at the second of the works that are uniquely works of Ottoman architecture. Again, Mimar Sinan is the architect. This is Yesil Kami, which is Yesil, I believe, means green in Turkish, so it's the green mosque, Yesil Kami. Also in Bursa, 1421. So this is about 60 or 70 years after the first example that we looked at. So you probably already, even in the detail and the refinement and the polish that you see here in this mihrab, you're probably seeing sophistication. Refinement is probably the best term. If you've been doing something over and over again for a period of 40 or 50 years already, you tend to kind of perfect that craft. So you're starting to see kind of an early example and then even a late example, which should show you the development and the refinement of the work. Decorative mukarnas. So we see it, the mukarnas here at the entryway, the elaborate mihrab, which we just looked at. And then the other thing that's unique about Yesil Kami is I didn't show, and actually I don't think the book had an example. Well, no, there was a plan in the text. If you have the text and you can look it up, it is actually on page, the book right here. If you have the text, go to page 447 and look at the figure 11.24. And if you don't have the text, just somebody respond on the announcements or the comments associated with this lecture, and I'll make sure and I'll grab the image from the text and I'll post it for you guys. But what you can see in the example that the text shows is not so much the Yesil Kami building itself, but the collection of the Yesil Kami associated with the 4 or 5 surrounding buildings kind of create this complex of this first sort of civic collection of buildings, which I would describe best as a campus. They form a kind of a civic campus of buildings, which there's a religious building, there's actually a tomb, which obviously is a place of burial, but associated also with it is an imaret, as we mentioned, which is the soup kitchen. There's a thermal bath associated with it, and a madrasa, which is a school. So it's kind of creating place or creating a civic space where somebody could come and basically spend the entire day and have 4 or 5 different functions take place in the same urban zone. Okay, this is Sehzade Kami. It's Sehzade. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Sehzade Kami, which is built 1543 through 1548. So we're in the middle of the 16th century already, and this is in Istanbul. Sehzade Kami, basically, Sehzade, I think, is a prince. I'm sorry. Yeah, a prince. So this is the Prince's Mosque. And this is really the first, we're kind of building up to this point, but pardon me, this is the first example where we see actually trying to, it's kind of throwing a punch that's equal to, or trying to be equal to, the punch that is Hagia Sophia. Remember again the notion of the semi-dome. Here you're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 semidomes. So you're seeing this collection of 4 semidomes, where at Hagia Sophia it's really 2 semidomes. So they are kind of experimenting and trying to invent something new for sure. The minarets you're seeing are similar but differentiated. There is a lot more articulation in the minarets that you see at Szehzadi Kami in comparison with Hagia Sophia. The main dome is fairly similar. The semi-domes have a little bit more articulation to them. And then the facade is also slightly differentiated. But the scale is almost the same. It's not quite as large as Hagia Sophia. So this dome doesn't span quite as much as Hagia Sophia does. So the book cites, as I mentioned, an effort to surpass Hagia Sophia, central dome, hemispheric radial semidomes. I'll show in a diagram here coming up. And then 4 corner domes that mark the 4 corners of the building. So there's the large dome. So this kind of stepping down, I would say, is also something that's unique, that sort of cascading of layers starting from the top, secondary, tertiary, 4th, 5th kind of level as it sort of steps down. This kind of layering is really a unique thing, I would say, in Islamic architecture. Oh, the pyramidal massing, I guess, is the term that the book used, the building up of the surfaces. Okay, here you can start to see the idea when I talk about a semi-dome, what I mean. Here is the primary dome, and here are the buttresses in the 4 corners that I mentioned earlier. But these things you see are basically they literally are the 4 semi-domes, which it's not quite, it's a half circle, really, attached onto the arch that spans between the corner columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, with 2 smaller semi-domes flanking each of the primary semi-domes. And then these 4 towers, 2, 3, 4, are these 1, 2, 3, 4 that we're looking at in the prior slide. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 1, 1, to give you a sense of kind of orientation. Minaret, I take that back. This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This octagonal volume is this octagonal volume here. Four corner domes and the slightly pointed arches. Next slide. Okay, here is the diagram that best articulates really the experimentation and the sequencing of the level to which they take the breaking down of the circle or the dome and sort of reattaching it and arranging it around. This is a simplified diagram of the Orhan Gazi Kami, which is taking the single semi-dome and attaching it to the rear of a full circular dome and tholobate, and flanking it with triple lined circular domes that don't rise up as high and really become kind of secondary or subservient. So even that tiering up or that stepping, that cascading, as I described it earlier, is establishing itself here as well. But also the idea of how do you attach a semi-dome or a semicircle to a circle architecturally, which graduates to the Yesil Kami in Bursa into taking it to the next level of taking a semi-dome on either side of the primary dome, and again flanking it here with 4 full domes, but also lowering them to kind of create that sort of cascading effect 3-dimensionally, which we don't see here because we're looking at a 2-dimensional diagram. And then finally, with the last project that we're going to look at, which is the Suleimani Kami, the Suleimani Mosque, which is basically taking the primary dome and doing a radial semi-dome concept around it. And by radial, I basically mean a circle 360 degrees around. So 1, 2, 3, 4 at the 4 cardinal points around the primary dome are these series of semi-domes. This diagram, I would say, best articulates really the main architectural endeavor of the of Islamic architecture in the Ottoman Empire. And here you can basically read 1, 2, 3 of the semi-domes around the single primary dome. So that should really already be obvious just by looking at this interior view here. Okay, and finally the Suleimani Kami, which is the 1570s, so end of the 16th century, and this is in Edirne, and this has the 4 semi-domes, which we can actually read here, 1, 2, 3, 4 on opposite side, serving the large dome. This is the point I was making from the 2-dimensional diagram, is when we're looking at a plan, what you're seeing is the projection of these shapes onto a ground plane. What is hard to read is the fact that hierarchically, this is the highest point, these are the next highest points, and these are the 3rd or 4th or sometimes 5th highest points. So highest point, second highest points, really the corner domes are the second highest points, the semi-domes are the 3rd highest points, and then the flanked circles on the 4 sides are the 5th or 6th highest points, and that's what's creating that kind of cascading effect on down, which I would say is really is best refined here at Suleimani Mosque or Suleimani Kami in relation to Sehzadi or Yezil or any of the other 2 or 3 projects that we looked at. So clearly kind of their most sophisticated or most refined version of the work. The single turret. The single turret there. And then it has inner minarets with 3 balconies. Let's see. You can see it best in this slide, actually. The inner minarets, which are referred to as the ones that are closest to the primary dome, have 1, 2, 3 balconies. And then the outer minarets, which are the smaller ones, have, even that steps down into having 2 balconies. And then also you see the alternating rhythm of narrow, wide, narrow, wide. You can see it. Let's see, where do we see it best? You can see it here. Wide, flanked by narrow, narrow. That's a good example of it. You can kind of read it here. Wide, narrow, narrow in terms of bays. You can read it again here. Widest, tallest, narrower, shorter in terms of height. So this sort of playfulness of wide, narrow, you see it again here. So wider to narrower and taller to shorter. Alternating rhythm is how the book describes it. Okay, and that's it. So it's Architecture of Islam. This is really Architecture of Islam Part 1. There's going to be an Architecture of Islam Part 2 lecture that I'll be posting in the next couple days. And I will develop the vocabulary terms. I'm not going to post the vocabulary terms because these are really just half of the terms from the first lecture. As I introduce 3 or 4 more terms in the next lecture, I will then post the terms in complete, and will assign the next essay, which will be the same essay that we've been doing so far, only on the architecture of Islam. And you can take from any of the slides that I've shown today or any of the slides in the upcoming lecture. Thank you.